What kind of father could turn his own son into a superstar, yet at the same time become the person that son feared the most? That was the complicated relationship between Michael Jackson and his father, Joseph Jackson. Michael Jackson, the legendary artist known as the King of Pop, became one of the most famous performers in history, forever remembered for iconic songs such as Billie Jean, 1982. But long before the world knew him as a superstar, Michael was simply a young boy being trained by his father to perform. Yet, on June 25, 2009, Michael Jackson died at the age of 50. Behind that extraordinary career, he left a vast fortune to his children, his mother, and charitable causes. But one name was completely absent from his will, the name of his own father, Joseph Jackson. Why? Joseph had played a major role in the early years of Michael's career. He managed the Jackson family and put Michael on stage while he was still a child. Without Joseph, could the Jackson 5 have become a phenomenon? Could Michael Jackson have become known around the world so quickly? And yet, when Michael became an adult, one of his most important decisions was to end his father's control over his career. Why would a son turn away from the very man who had helped introduce him to the world? Why did Michael once say that he was afraid of his own father? So what really happened between this father and son? Was Joseph Jackson simply a strict father who believed that discipline was the price of success? Or did Michael spend his entire life trying to escape the control of the father who had first put him on the stage? How did a father-son relationship that began with music, ambition, and dreams ultimately become one of the most complicated relationships in Michael Jackson's life? Let's go back to the beginning and uncover the story of Michael Jackson and the father whose shadow he seemingly could never truly escape. Part 1. The Father Behind the Legend. Before Michael Jackson became the King of Pop, before millions of people knew his name, there was a father with a dream of his own. His name was Joseph Jackson. Joseph had once dreamed of becoming a professional musician himself. In the early 1950s, he formed a blues group called the Falcons with his brother Luther. Joseph played guitar and hoped that music would become his path to success. But the dream never became reality. The group failed to secure a recording contract and eventually fell apart. For Joseph, this was more than just the end of a band. It was the collapse of a dream he had carried for years. He eventually had to put music aside and take a job as a crane operator at a steel mill, working to support his large family. But perhaps the dream never truly disappeared. It simply found a different way to survive. That opportunity came through his children. By the 1960s, Joseph noticed that some of his older sons, particularly Jackie, Tito, and Jermaine, were becoming interested in music. They would secretly take their father's guitar and experiment with it when he wasn't looking. When Joseph discovered what they were doing, he made a decision that would change the history of popular music. Instead of stopping them, he organized them. The family group began as the Jackson Brothers, with Joseph taking control of their rehearsals and development. What started as a group of young brothers making music together would eventually become the Jackson 5, one of the most recognizable family groups in American music. But there was something unusual about Joseph's approach. He wasn't simply watching his children have fun with music. He saw discipline, opportunity, and potentially something much bigger. Rehearsals became serious. The children were expected to practice repeatedly, improve their timing, perfect their dancing, and perform as professionals. Joseph had failed to achieve his own dream as a musician. Now his children had a chance to achieve what he couldn't. And this is where the story becomes complicated. Was Joseph simply a determined father who recognized an opportunity for his children? Was he trying to give them the career he had never been able to have? Or was he using his children's talent to continue a dream that had originally belonged to him? Perhaps at first the difference was impossible to see. After all, parents often dream of giving their children opportunities they never had themselves. But when the children become the center of that dream, the line between guidance and control can become dangerously thin. And Joseph was about to discover that one of his children possessed something far beyond anything he had expected. A voice, a presence. and a natural ability that would eventually make him the most famous member of the entire family. That child was Michael Jackson. He was only 5 years old, and his arrival at the center of the family's musical journey would completely change the fate of the Jackson family, and the relationship between Michael and his father forever. But what happened when Joseph realized that his youngest son might be the key to everything he had once dreamed of becoming? That is where the story truly begins. Part 2. Michael, the 5-year-old boy who changed everything. By the time the Jackson brothers had begun taking music seriously, Joseph Jackson already had a clear idea of how he wanted the group to work. Jermaine, the older and more experienced brother, was expected to be the lead singer. Michael, at only 5 years old, was still just the youngest child in the family. No one could have imagined that this little boy would soon become the most important figure in the entire Jackson family story. But Michael's mother, Katherine Jackson, noticed something that Joseph had not yet fully recognized. She heard her youngest son sing, and she knew there was something different about his voice. Katherine encouraged Joseph to listen to Michael. But according to the story told in the script, Joseph was reluctant at first. He already had a plan for the group, and in that plan, Jermaine was the lead. Why would he need to change it for a 5-year-old? But Katherine continued to insist. Eventually, Joseph listened, and that moment changed everything. Michael's voice was unusually expressive for such a young child. There was something in the way he sang that immediately separated him from the others. He wasn't simply copying what he had heard. He seemed to understand the emotion of the music naturally. Joseph now faced a decision. Would he continue with the plan he had already created, or would he place his youngest son at the center? He chose Michael. From that point forward, Michael gradually became the focal point of the group. His voice, stage presence, and natural ability began attracting attention. The little boy who had once stood on the sidelines was now moving toward the center of the family's musical ambitions. And this was the moment when Michael's relationship with his father began to take on a completely different meaning. To Katherine, Michael was first and foremost her child, a little boy with a remarkable gift. But to Joseph, Michael represented something much bigger. He represented possibility. The possibility that his children could succeed where he had failed. The possibility that the family could escape financial hardship. The possibility that the dream Joseph had once abandoned as a musician could finally become reality through his children. And perhaps most importantly, Michael seemed to possess the exact qualities Joseph needed to make that dream happen. But there was a dangerous question hiding beneath that opportunity. When does a father stop seeing his child simply as his son and start seeing him as the key to his own ambitions? For Michael, the answer would become increasingly complicated. He was still a child. He still needed a father's affection, protection, and reassurance. Instead, his extraordinary talent placed him under an extraordinary amount of pressure. The more successful Michael became, the more important he was to the family's future. And the more important he became, the more Joseph demanded from him. This was the beginning of a transformation that would eventually take Michael from a 5-year-old boy singing with his brothers to one of the biggest stars the world had ever seen. But there was another side to that transformation. The boy who became the family's greatest hope was also becoming the child under the greatest pressure. And as Michael's star began to rise, the question was no longer whether Joseph could make his son successful. The question was, what would Michael have to sacrifice to become that successful? Part 3. When discipline became fear. As Michael's talent grew, so did his father's expectations. Rehearsals were no longer simply about learning songs or having fun as a family. Joseph Jackson demanded precision. Every note had to be right. Every dance step had to be synchronized. Every movement on stage had to be repeated until it was perfect. For the Jackson children, there was little room for mistakes. According to accounts described in the source material, Joseph would sit nearby during rehearsals, closely watching every performance. When one of the children missed a note, forgot a step, or fell out of rhythm, punishment could follow. For Michael, this created something more powerful than ordinary pressure. It created fear. Imagine being only a child and standing in front of your father knowing that one mistake could bring punishment. Instead of focusing only on the music, you begin watching your father's reaction. Instead of asking, "Did I sing that note correctly?" you begin wondering, "Will he be angry?" The rehearsal room was supposed to be the place where Michael developed his extraordinary talent, but it also became a place where anxiety and fear could grow. Michael later spoke about the physical punishment he experienced as a child. The source material describes him recalling how his father would use a belt when the children made mistakes during rehearsals. Other accounts also describe moments when Joseph lost his temper and physically punished his children. These experiences were not simply about pain in the moment. They changed the emotional atmosphere of the family. Michael and his brothers were expected to perform at a professional level while still being children. Their father was not merely watching them as a parent, he was also acting as their manager, coach, and disciplinarian. And that created a difficult question. Could Michael separate his father from the man controlling his career? For a child, those roles can become impossible to separate. The person who was supposed to provide safety was also the person whose approval Michael desperately needed. The person who helped develop his talent was also the person he feared disappointing. That contradiction would follow Michael for years. What makes the story even more striking is that these memories did not simply disappear when Michael became famous. The source material indicates that Michael was speaking about his father's treatment of him as early as 1979, long before he reached the absolute peak of his career. Even after becoming one of the most successful entertainers in the world, the memory of being that frightened child remained part of his story. And perhaps this is the most important point. Joseph may have believed that fear would make his children stronger, more disciplined, and more successful. But success and emotional security are not the same thing. Michael learned how to perform under pressure. He learned how to pursue perfection. He learned how to command a stage in front of thousands, then millions of people. But behind the superstar was still the memory of a young boy who had learned that making a mistake could have consequences. Training created the performer. Pressure created the perfectionist, but fear left a wound that fame could not simply erase. And as Michael grew older, another part of their relationship would become even more painful. His father was no longer satisfied with controlling how he performed. He began to influence how Michael saw himself. Part 4. The father Michael could not call Daddy. There was something deeply unusual about Michael Jackson's relationship with his father. Joseph Jackson was not simply a strict father. According to the accounts described in the source material, he deliberately created a distance between himself and his children. They were not supposed to call him Daddy. They were supposed to call him Joseph. For a child, that small distinction can mean much more than a name. Daddy represents warmth, safety, and intimacy. Joseph sounds formal, distant, almost like a separation between a father and the children he was supposed to protect. For Michael, that emotional distance existed alongside the enormous pressure of his growing career. As the Jackson 5 became more successful, Michael's life became increasingly focused on performance. He was no longer simply a child singing with his brothers. He was becoming the center of the family's success. And the more valuable his talent became, the greater the expectations placed upon him. But there was another problem. As Michael entered his teenage years, his appearance began to change. Like many teenagers, he experienced acne and the natural changes that come with growing up. But instead of receiving reassurance from his father, Michael later recalled being teased about his appearance, particularly about his nose. Joseph reportedly made comments about Michael having a big nose and compared his appearance negatively with other members of the family. For a young person already living under enormous pressure, those words could be devastating. Michael later spoke about how deeply those comments affected him. He described crying and feeling uncomfortable with his appearance. What might have been a temporary insecurity for another teenager became something much more powerful in Michael's mind. The boy who was constantly being watched on stage was now beginning to watch himself through the eyes of his father, and that raises a troubling question. What happens when the person whose approval you want most becomes the person who makes you question your own worth? But the emotional distance between Michael and Joseph went even further. The source material describes another incident from Michael's childhood, in which Joseph frightened him by wearing a mask and entering his room through a window. Joseph reportedly intended to teach his son a lesson about leaving the window open. But for Michael, the experience became associated with fear. The incident was not simply forgotten when the night ended. The source material connects it with later nightmares and fears about someone entering his bedroom or kidnapping him. Whether Joseph intended to frighten his son temporarily or teach him a lesson, the emotional impact described in Michael's story was much deeper. And this is where the relationship becomes more complicated than the story of a strict father. Michael was growing up in an environment where the same person could represent authority, pressure, judgment, and fear. Yet that person was also his father. So how could a child make sense of those conflicting emotions? How could Michael stand on a stage in front of thousands of screaming fans with confidence, while still carrying fear connected to the man who had been standing behind him since childhood? Perhaps that is the greatest paradox of Michael Jackson's early life. The world saw a fearless performer, but behind the performer was a child who desperately wanted approval and security from the one person who seemed unable to provide it. And that leads us to the question that would follow Michael into adulthood. Why could one of the most famous children in the world still be so afraid of his own father? The answer would become clearer when Michael finally gained something he had never truly possessed before: control over his own life. Part 5. Michael became the king of pop, but he was still Joseph's son. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Michael Jackson was no longer simply the youngest member of the Jackson 5. He was becoming a star in his own right. The little boy who had once stood under his father's strict supervision was now an internationally recognized performer. His voice had matured, his stage presence had become extraordinary, and audiences everywhere were beginning to see something different in him. Then came Thriller. Released in 1982, the album transformed Michael Jackson from a successful performer into a global phenomenon. His fame reached a level few artists had ever experienced. He was no longer simply part of the Jackson family. He was becoming the king of pop. But there was a strange contradiction at the heart of his success. The more powerful Michael became professionally, the less power his father seemed to have over the outside world. Yet inside the family, Joseph still wanted influence. Michael was now surrounded by professional advisors, lawyers, managers, and other people who were helping him make decisions about his career. These professionals were not part of Joseph's original system of control, and Joseph did not always trust them. According to the source material, he openly criticized some of Michael's advisors and accused them of taking advantage of his son. He also tried to persuade Michael to return to family management. But Michael was beginning to understand something important. His career was no longer simply a family project. It was his life. And for the first time, he had the power to make decisions without automatically following his father's wishes. Then came a moment that revealed just how complicated their relationship had become. When Michael was 21 years old, he decided that he would no longer allow Joseph to control his career. But Michael could not bring himself to tell his father face to face. Instead, lawyers and consultants delivered the documents to Joseph. Think about what that means. This was Michael Jackson, one of the most famous young performers in the world. Millions of people wanted to meet him. Record companies wanted his music. Fans screamed his name wherever he went. He could stand on a stage in front of an enormous crowd without hesitation. But facing his own father was different. The source material describes Michael as being deeply frightened of Joseph. His fear was reportedly so intense that even the presence of his father could produce a severe physical reaction. This creates one of the most powerful contradictions in their entire story. The world saw Michael Jackson as powerful, but Michael himself still felt powerless in front of Joseph. His professional success had changed almost everything around him, but it could not instantly erase the emotional patterns created during childhood. Joseph had helped put Michael on the stage. Now Michael was finally stepping off his father's path and choosing his own. And that decision was more than a business decision. It was a declaration of independence. Michael was no longer simply the youngest son in a family band. He was an adult artist with his own vision, his own advisors, and his own future. But gaining independence came with a painful price. The more Michael separated his career from Joseph, the more complicated their relationship became. And there was still one final question. If Michael had finally escaped his father's professional control, could Joseph still find another way to influence him? The answer would come during one of the most controversial chapters in Michael Jackson's career, when family, money, loyalty, and guilt collided on the biggest stage of all. Part 6. The moment Michael said, "It's time to end this." By the time the Victory Tour was being organized, Michael Jackson had already become a global superstar. But despite his enormous success, the influence of his family, and particularly his father, had not completely disappeared. Joseph still understood the power of the Jackson name. To him, the family's success was something that could continue to grow. More concerts meant more money. More appearances meant more opportunities. And with Michael at the center of the family, the Jackson name seemed almost unstoppable. But Michael was beginning to see things differently. He no longer wanted every decision to be made simply because it benefited the family. He wanted to make decisions based on what he believed was right. The Victory Tour became one of the clearest tests of that independence. One of the biggest controversies involved the ticketing system. Fans were reportedly required to send money in advance for the opportunity to purchase tickets, creating a situation that many people considered unfair, particularly for ordinary fans who could not easily afford the upfront cost. Michael was uncomfortable with the arrangement, but at first, the pressure surrounding the family and the tour made it difficult for him to simply walk away. Then something unexpected happened. An 11-year-old fan named LaDonna Jones from Texas wrote Michael a letter. She explained that she had been working small jobs and saving money because she wanted to see him perform. But the ticket system made it impossible for her to afford the required payment. Her message struck Michael deeply. She wasn't a powerful executive. She wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't someone who could influence the music industry. She was simply a young fan who wanted a chance to see her favorite performer. And Michael listened. He called a press conference and announced that the ticketing system would be changed. More importantly, he said he would give his share of the profits from the tour to charity. It was a remarkable decision. Michael was willing to walk away from millions of dollars rather than allow his fans to feel exploited. And Joseph and the other members of the family were reportedly shocked. For years, Michael had been expected to cooperate with decisions made for the benefit of the family. Now, for perhaps the clearest time yet, he was publicly making a decision based on his own principles. But the biggest confrontation was still ahead. At the final concert in Los Angeles, Michael stepped onto the stage and announced that the performance would be the last tour for the Jackson 5. To the audience, it sounded like the end of an era. To Joseph, it meant something much bigger. Future plans were already being considered. More shows, more countries, more revenue. And Michael Jackson's extraordinary popularity would have been at the center of all of it. Then Michael ended those plans with a single decision. He was done. This was no longer simply about music. It was about control. For years, Joseph had helped shape Michael's career and had expected the family to remain connected through their shared success. But Michael was now drawing a line between being a son and being controlled. He could love his family and still choose his own future. He could appreciate where his career began without allowing his father to determine where it would go. And that was the moment the balance of power finally changed. Joseph wanted to keep making money from the Jackson name. Michael wanted the right to decide what happened to his own life. For the first time, Michael was not simply following the family's path. He was choosing his own. But if Michael had finally broken free professionally, one question remained. How far would he go to protect that freedom? Part 7. From Son to Completely Independent Man. After Michael Jackson finally separated himself from the Jackson 5 professionally, something fundamental began to change. For the first time, Michael was no longer simply the youngest son in a famous musical family. He was an independent artist. His career belonged to him. His decisions belonged to him. And increasingly, so did his personal life. But independence did not mean that Joseph Jackson disappeared. Joseph continued pursuing business and music projects connected to the Jackson family name. The Jackson name had become incredibly valuable, and Joseph continued looking for opportunities to build upon that reputation. Michael, however, increasingly kept his distance. He had spent much of his childhood with his career intertwined with his family. Now that he had established himself as a global superstar, he was determined to create a world where his personal and professional decisions could remain under his own control. That boundary became especially clear at Neverland Ranch. According to the source material, Joseph could not simply arrive at Neverland whenever he wanted. Michael's security team was instructed not to allow his father onto the property without Michael's approval. Think about how significant that was. This was the same father who had once controlled Michael's rehearsals, his performances, and his early career. Now, Michael had enough independence to decide whether that father could even enter his home. The balance of power had completely changed. But Michael did not simply distance himself from Joseph physically. He also established boundaries around his wealth. In 2002, Michael finalized his will. According to the source material, his estate was divided among his children, his mother Katherine Jackson, and charitable causes. One name, however, was missing: Joseph Jackson. His own father was not included as a beneficiary. For many people, this detail might look like the ultimate rejection. After everything Joseph had done to build the family's career, why would Michael leave him out? Was it anger? Was it punishment? Was Michael finally trying to make his father pay for everything that had happened during his childhood? Or was there another explanation? Perhaps Michael was simply protecting something he had spent decades trying to obtain: control over his own life. Michael had already learned that fame did not automatically create freedom. He could sell millions of records and still feel trapped. He could perform in front of enormous crowds and still carry the fears of childhood. He could become one of the most powerful entertainers on earth and still have to establish boundaries with the people closest to him. So the will may be understood not simply as a statement about money, but as a statement about control. Michael was deciding who would benefit from the life he had built: his children, his mother, Charity, but not his father. And that decision raises one of the most difficult questions in their entire relationship. Was this the revenge of a son who had finally gained the power to say no? Or was it the final act of self-protection from a man who had spent his entire life trying to reclaim a sense of freedom? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere in between. Michael did not need to erase his past. He simply needed to stop allowing that past to determine his future. The boy who had once needed his father's permission to step onto a stage had become a man who could decide who was allowed into his home, his career, and his financial life. But there was still one final chapter. Because in 2009, Michael Jackson died. And when the world began mourning the king of pop, the complicated relationship between Michael and Joseph would once again become impossible to ignore. What would Joseph say about his son, when the son he had helped create was no longer there to answer him? Part 8. The father who created the legend, but could never win back his son's love. On June 25, 2009, Michael Jackson died at the age of 50. The world lost the king of pop. Fans around the globe mourned the man whose music, dancing, and performances had defined generations. But for Joseph Jackson, the loss was also deeply personal. After Michael's death, Joseph spoke publicly about his son and the enormous star the world had lost. Yet some of his comments created controversy, particularly when he appeared to discuss business and promote his own record label activities during a time when the public was grieving Michael. For many fans, the timing was difficult to understand. How could a father speak about business so soon after losing his son? Why did some of his words seem to focus more on the loss of a superstar than the loss of a child? Those questions triggered strong reactions. Some viewers saw Joseph as a father who had spent decades connecting Michael's value to his success and earning potential. Others argued that, whatever his mistakes, Joseph had still played an important role in helping his children enter the music industry. But the overwhelming emotional response from many viewers was not simply anger toward Joseph. It was sadness for Michael. People looked back at his childhood and wondered what kind of life he might have experienced without such intense pressure. They remembered the young performer who had been expected to work while other children were simply growing up. And perhaps the most powerful part of the story is what Michael reportedly tried to do differently when he became a father himself. He had experienced a childhood where performance, discipline, expectations, and fear were deeply intertwined. So when Michael had children of his own, he had the opportunity to make a different choice. Instead of repeating everything he had experienced, he could give his children something he had desperately needed himself: love, protection, and emotional security. This is where Michael's story becomes more than a story about a famous father and son. It becomes a story about breaking a cycle. Joseph had described his own upbringing as harsh and authoritarian. He believed that strict discipline had helped shape him, and that his methods were necessary to keep his children focused and successful. But Michael had experienced the other side of that philosophy. He knew what it felt like to be a child who wanted approval. He knew what it felt like to be afraid of disappointing his father. And perhaps that is why becoming a father himself gave Michael a chance to create something different. He could not change his childhood. He could not erase the years of pressure. He could not rewrite the relationship he had with Joseph. But he could decide what kind of father he would be to his own children. And that may be one of the most important parts of this entire story. Joseph helped put Michael on the road to fame. He helped shape the young performer who would eventually become a global icon. But no amount of professional success could guarantee the one thing Michael may have wanted most from his father: a simple sense of love and safety. In the end, Joseph helped create a legend the entire world would admire. But the relationship between father and son remained deeply complicated. And perhaps that leaves us with a question that has no simple answer. Did Joseph Jackson create Michael Jackson, or did Michael Jackson spend his entire life trying to escape his father's shadow? Maybe the truth is that both can be true. Joseph helped open the door to the world of music, but Michael was the one who walked through it, transformed it, and ultimately built a life of his own. And behind the king of pop, there was always another story. The story of a son who spent his life trying to become more than the role his father had chosen for him.